Close your eyes now and imagine yourself waking slowly, not in your own bed, but in the cold dawn of a New England winter. It is early in the year 1776, and the world around you is heavy with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and something less pleasant, something that lingers in the crowded camps of an untested army. You lie on a makeshift bed, little more than straw piled in the corner of a drafty tent or barn. Around you, men stir and cough. Their breath rises in faint white clouds in the freezing air. Some mutter prayers. Others groan as stiff joints remind them of yesterday's march. Congratulations, traveler. You have awoken in George Washington's army. It is an army of farmers and blacksmiths, fishermen and boys barely old enough to shave. It is also an army of men in rags, missing teeth, some limping, some coughing. A rabble, the British officers call them. And yet, these ragged men hold within them the hope of something new, something greater than any of them can yet name. As you rise and step outside, the scene is overwhelming. The roads around Boston are choked with wagons, hauling barrels of provisions or casks of rum. Horses snort and stamp in the mud. A few women move among the soldiers, selling food or washing clothes, though they are far fewer than in the well-supplied British camp. The men around you are armed, but their weapons are as mismatched as their clothing. Some carry flintlock muskets, heavy and long. Others have old fowling pieces, or even ancient hunting rifles. Many of these weapons are treasured family tools, passed down across generations, and now pressed into service against the king's redcoats. Some of the men know how to fire well, loading, priming, and shooting 3 times in a minute. But many waste precious powder, firing into the air for sport or at a passing goose. And powder is the greatest shortage of all. Washington has less than 10,000 pounds for the entire army. Enough, perhaps, for 9 rounds per man. And yet, despite hunger, sickness, and want, the army holds its ground. The greatest enemy in camp is not the British army across the frozen bay. It is disease. The latrines are shallow pits, often ignored. Too many men leave their waste scattered in the fields, fouling the ground and the air. Dysentery spreads quickly. Fevers rise and sweep through the tents. Typhoid, typhus, smallpox. Doctors do what they can with poultices, bleeding, and bitter draughts. But in truth, little helps. Washington knows disease could destroy his army before a single battle is fought. He orders stricter cleanliness, stricter rules, but discipline comes slowly. These are not trained soldiers. They are citizens, and used to the demands of constant order. And yet, through the sickness, the men endure. Their spirits rise and fall with rumor of reinforcements, of victories, of ships sighted in the harbor. At times, their hope is as fragile as the frost that melts by midday. At others, it burns like the fires that warm their hands at night. At the center of this army stands George Washington. He is 43 years old, tall and imposing, with reddish-brown hair and piercing gray-blue eyes. Though he has never commanded such an army before, he carries himself with dignity, his blue commander's ribbon across his chest marking him as a man set apart. Washington has only recently taken command, July of the past year, 1775. He inherited an army not of professionals, but of volunteers. An army without a flag, without uniforms, without even enough powder for a single true battle. He spends his days on horseback, riding the lines, inspecting the earthworks, urging discipline, and reading aloud new rules each morning after prayers. Yet he too knows fear. In his diary, he admits to many uneasy hours. He doubts himself, wonders whether he is equal to the task. But he is not alone. Around him rise men who will prove themselves. Nathaniel Greene, the young Rhode Island foundryman, and Henry Knox, the cheerful Boston bookseller turned artilleryman. They too are untested. They too are learning. Together, they shape this army into something more than a mob. Something the world will soon reckon with. Take a slow breath and picture the summer of 1775, months before Washington's army tightened its grip around Boston. War has already begun. It came suddenly, with shots at Lexington and Concord in April, and then with terrible fury in June at a place called Breed's Hill, though history remembers it as Bunker Hill. The British claimed victory that day, but the cost was staggering. More than 1,000 of His Majesty's soldiers were killed or wounded before the Redcoats drove the American militia from the heights. One British officer remarked bitterly that a few more such victories would destroy the army entirely. Ships later carried the broken remains of that battle back to England. One vessel alone brought home 170 sick and wounded, some without arms, some without legs. Their clothes hung loose on their wasted bodies, the smell of sickness clinging to the air. Alongside them traveled nearly 60 widows and children, a shocking human cargo that drove home the reality of this colonial rebellion. Boston remained under siege, the British trapped inside like birds in a cage, while disease and hunger spread through both armies. Now the scene shifts across the ocean, to London. It is the 26th of October, 1775. The autumn air is crisp and the sky is clear. 60,000 people line the royal route, eager for a glimpse of their king. George III, just 37 years old, rides in splendor to the Palace of Westminster. Duty burns in his eyes. He believes the colonies must be brought back to obedience, not tomorrow, not next year, but now. When he enters the House of Lords, he delivers his message with solemn weight. America, he declares, is in rebellion. Its leaders are traitors, bent on independence. He will raise land and sea forces to crush the uprising. And, though he does not yet say the names, foreign soldiers will soon be hired to aid the crown. Many members of Parliament cheer. Lord Sandwich scoffs at the idea that the colonists can resist. They are raw, he insists, undisciplined, cowards. Another general boasts he could march across the continent with just 5,000 British regulars. And yet some voices urge caution. Edmund Burke, speaking with sorrow, calls them our colonies. He warns of ruin if reconciliation is cast aside. But when the votes are counted, the king's side wins easily. War, not peace, is chosen. Back in America, Washington grows impatient. It is September 1775, and Boston still lies in British hands. Washington convenes a council of war. Around the table sit his generals, among them Charles Lee, his second-in-command, a former British officer with a sharp tongue and a fondness for dogs. There is also Artemas Ward, a stout Massachusetts farmer once in overall command, steady but uninspiring. Washington asks them plainly, can we strike Boston directly? Can we ferry our men across the bay in boats and storm the town? The generals debate. Winter is coming fast. Enlistments are expiring. Gunpowder is scarce. What if the boats ground on the mudflats? What if the redcoats pour musket fire onto the stranded men? It could be another slaughter, like Bunker Hill. At last, the council agrees. No assault, not yet. The risk is too great. Washington accepts the decision, but he cannot let go of the idea. Quietly, he orders flat-bottomed boats to be built. Quietly, he keeps writing to Congress, hinting that bold action must come. His restlessness grows. By late November, the mood in camp is grim. Enlistments are expiring. Of 10,000 men, fewer than 1,000 agree to stay on. The war chest is empty. The soldiers have not been paid in weeks. Washington confides in his secretary, Joseph Reed, that the situation is truly alarming. He despairs of what he calls a dirty mercenary spirit among the New England troops. I would never have accepted command, he writes, had I foreseen the difficulties. On November 21st, the first snow falls. Winter arrives with a vengeance. Bitter winds, frozen ground, icy storms that lash the harbor. In Boston, conditions are worse still. The British cut down trees and tear apart houses for firewood. Food dwindles. Scurvy spreads. Smallpox rages. Even deserters crossing the lines confess that the Americans are no better, tired, unpaid, longing for home. Washington, lying awake at night, feels utterly alone. Yet in the midst of despair, a plan begins to take shape. Colonel Henry Knox, the large and cheerful Boston bookseller turned officer, has been sent north. His mission? to bring back the heavy cannon captured at Fort Ticonderoga in New York. It is a task most men would call impossible. The guns weigh tons. The journey is 300 miles through frozen wilderness, across mountains, rivers, and snowbound forests. But Knox is undaunted. With oxen and sleds, he drags the cannon step by step. Townsfolk gather to cheer as the mighty train creaks through villages, iron wheels grinding on ice. Men and animals alike strain against the ropes, the frozen rivers groaning beneath their weight. By midwinter, the great guns are on their way. Washington, worn and weary, clings to this hope. Perhaps, with artillery in hand, the siege may finally end. Close your eyes and step into the bitter cold of January 1776. General George Washington is downcast. He confides in his secretary that he sometimes wishes he had taken a musket and marched in the ranks instead of bearing the crushing weight of command. At other times, he dreams of retreating to the wilderness, living simply in a cabin or even a wigwam, far from war and politics. His army is shrinking. His soldiers' enlistments are expiring. The treasury is empty. Powder and muskets are vanishing as men return home with their weapons. Washington writes sleepless letters at night, admitting that few truly know the predicament they are in. And yet, he wonders if Providence itself is blinding the British to his weakness. How else could they sit in Boston, apparently unaware of how thin the American defenses truly are? Through reliable intelligence, Washington learns the British are preparing ships. Their likely destination, New York. New York is a city of vast importance, a deep harbor and a crossroads of trade. But it is also home to many loyalists. Nathaniel Greene warns that if sentiment there turns against the patriot cause, it could strike a fatal blow to unity. There are only two choices, he believes: defend New York or burn it. General Charles Lee offers to go at once and prepare defenses. Washington hesitates, knowing Congress must approve. But fortune intervenes. John Adams, home on leave, assures him New York is indeed the key to the continent. With Adams's words, Washington receives full authority to act. On January 8th, he dispatches General Lee to New York. The race for control has begun. February brings no relief. The cold bites harder. Food and firewood are scarce. On February 16th, Washington gathers his generals for another council of war. Once more, he presses for a bold attempt to storm Boston. But his commanders are divided. Horatio Gates calls it a major question. Israel Putnam laments the lack of powder. Greene, weakened by jaundice, writes that the prospect is dreadful, horrible if it succeeded, worse still if it failed. The council says no. They will not risk a direct assault. Instead, they turn to another plan, one Washington had long considered: Dorchester Heights, the rocky ridge south of Boston that towers above the harbor. If cannon could be placed there, the British fleet would be trapped. General Howe had once declared he would sally forth if the rebels ever occupied the heights. Washington seizes on this threat. If Howe attacks, the Americans will be ready. If he retreats, Boston will be free. Preparations begin in silence and secrecy. Washington orders timber frames filled with hay bales and brush to muffle the sound of wagons on frozen ground. Barrels filled with earth are ready to roll down the slopes at attackers. Night bombardments are planned to mask the noise of movement. The cannon brought by Henry Knox from Fort Ticonderoga, more than 50 pieces of iron and brass, are now in position. They will roar from Roxbury, from Cobble Hill, and from Lechmere Point, a wall of thunder to distract the enemy. 3,000 men under General John Thomas are chosen to seize Dorchester Heights. 4,000 more will wait in reserve for an amphibious strike on Boston should Howe counterattack. It is an elaborate, daring scheme. The fate of Boston, perhaps of the Revolution itself, hangs on its success. At last, the night comes. March 4th, 1776. From Cambridge, the American guns open fire. A furious bombardment shakes Boston. The noise is deafening, echoing across the bay. Yet it is meant mostly as cover, a thunderous mask for what happens in the shadows. While the cannon roar, General Thomas leads 2,000 men across the Dorchester Causeway. Hay bales shield their movement. Carts creak under the weight of fascines, chandeliers, and Knox's great guns. Reverend William Gordon will later call the night perfectly beautiful, with a mild wind and a brilliant full moon, as if the Almighty himself had granted favor. Through the night, the procession moves in solemn silence. Soldiers labor up the steep slopes, dragging timber and cannon, working with frantic speed. Oxen strain, wagons groan. They make 3, even 4 trips, never resting. By the faint light of dawn, the work is done. At least 20 heavy cannon stare down on Boston from Dorchester Heights. An achievement so swift, so complete, that even the British cannot believe their eyes. Daybreak. General William Howe surveys the scene and gasps. "These fellows have done more work in one night," he mutters, "than my whole army could do in 3 months." The British fleet is exposed. Admiral Shootholm warns that no ship can remain in the harbor unless the rebels are driven from the heights. Howe has no choice. He orders 2,000 men to prepare for an assault. But the plan is madness. Captain Archibald Robertson calls it suicidal. The fate of Boston, perhaps of America, rests on this gamble. As evening falls, nature intervenes. A sudden storm rises, first with rain, then hail, then snow driven by hurricane winds. 2 British transports run aground. Fences are torn down, windows shattered. Lieutenant Isaac Bangs calls it the worst storm he has ever endured. By morning, the storm still rages. The attack is canceled. General Heath of the American Army concludes simply, "Kind heaven intervened." Within hours, it becomes clear. Boston cannot be held. In less than 2 days, the security of the British position dissolves. Confusion reigns. Soldiers, loyalists, families, all scramble to leave. Supplies are dumped into the harbor. Hogsheads of sugar, barrels of flour, even the commander's elegant coach. Cannon are spiked and abandoned. Shops are broken open, houses plundered. On March 8th, town officials cross the lines under a white flag. Howe will evacuate, but only if the rebels do not fire on his departing troops. Washington agrees. He wants Boston freed, not destroyed. On March 9th, the British unleash one last bombardment, thunder echoing all night. In the morning, Americans gather 700 cannonballs from the fields, more iron than casualties. The effort is futile. By March 17th, the Redcoats are gone. Nearly 10,000 troops and more than 1,000 loyalist civilians sail away, their ships filling the harbor as they set course for Halifax. Boston, after 11 long months of siege, is free. For George Washington, it is a moment of triumph. With scarce powder, with dwindling numbers, with disease and despair in his camp, he has outmaneuvered one of the world's greatest armies. Not by storming walls or charging lines, but by patience, deception, and daring at the right moment. The British have abandoned Boston. The cause of liberty has its first great victory. And yet, Washington knows this is only the beginning. Even now, the enemy sails north to regroup. New York, the true prize awaits. Ahead lies uncertainty, defeat, and long years of war. But for one shining moment, on the cold, windswept slopes of Dorchester Heights, hope burns brightly. The impossible has been done. It is the morning of March 17th, 1776, St. Patrick's Day. At 4 in the morning, more than 8,000 British soldiers march through the narrow, dark streets of Boston. Behind them, carts groan under the weight of baggage. Families cling to one another. Loyalists, fearful of patriot vengeance, follow the Redcoats in haste. By 7 o'clock, the wharves are crowded. Ships are already thronging the harbor, sails rising in the cold dawn wind. By 9, the entire fleet is underway, more than 120 ships, carrying nearly 11,000 souls. Soldiers, wives, children, and loyalist civilians. From the American lines, soldiers cheer and weep. After nearly a year of siege, Boston is free. Many call it the Lord's doing. A miracle at last. That same morning, Washington shows his characteristic grace. He grants the honor of leading the first American troops into Boston to General Artemas Ward, the New England man who had commanded before him, and the first to favor Dorchester Heights. To the beat of drums and the flutter of flags, Ward's men march through Roxbury Gate and into the city. Washington himself attends Sunday service, where his chaplain reads from Exodus, "The Lord fought for them against the Egyptians." The parallel is clear. When Washington finally rides into Boston on March 18th, he is surprised by what he finds. The town is damaged, but not destroyed. Hancock's mansion still stands, spare despite having housed a British general. The marks of desperation are everywhere: spiked cannon, shattered wagons, scuttled ships. And yet, Boston lives. The siege of Boston is a triumph, but Washington has no illusions. The British, humiliated, will return more determined than ever. Already, political change sweeps the colonies. Thomas Paine's common sense urges separation. The King's speech in October, condemning the rebellion as treason and calling for foreign mercenaries, has ended any hope of reconciliation. Washington himself now speaks openly. It is time to shake off all connections with Britain. On January 1st, 1776, even before Boston's freedom, Washington had raised a new flag, 13 red and white stripes, with the British colors in the corner. The enemy mistook it for surrender. In truth, it was a new beginning, a continental army, fighting for a united cause. With Boston secure, Washington turns his eyes to New York. The march begins in early April. For 2 weeks, the army winds its way through New England. Columns of men tramp along muddy roads, their muskets glinting in the spring sun. Farmers leave their fields to cheer them. Women offer bread and cider. Children run alongside, waving. The mood is lifted. At last, the army is on the move, away from the long siege. Spirits rise with every mile. Yet the march is not easy. Roads are rutted and rough. Wagons break down. Men grow weary. But Washington presses them forward in haste. He knows the British fleet will strike at New York, and every day counts. By April 13th, Washington enters New York City. His headquarters is set at the Kennedy Mansion, number 1 Broadway. The city astonishes many of his men. The cobbler Joseph Hodgkins writes that New York exceeds all places he has seen. Though living is dear, Lieutenant Isaac Bangs is troubled instead. The city seems lacking in piety. He visits churches of every denomination, preferring the Dutch for their sincerity. He warns that soldiers may be debauched by the temptations of the town's darker quarters. For Washington, the concern is different. Defenses are only half built. The army crowds the narrow streets, but half are unfit for duty. Disease and dissipation threaten order. And New York is unlike Boston. Surrounded by water, flanked by rivers, it can only be defended by whoever commands the sea. New York is a city divided. Loyalist sentiment runs deep. 2/3 of property belongs to Tories. The royal governor, William Tryon, directs affairs secretly from a ship in the harbor. Conspiracies and sabotage are whispered daily. Washington feels the strain. In Boston, he struggled with distrust of New Englanders. Here, men from every colony bicker and clash. Discipline is poor. He fears the fragile unity could tear apart. Yet Providence, he insists, is their only guide. Then in late June, the storm begins. On June 29th, officers stand atop Washington's headquarters, telescopes in hand. Signals rise on the hills of Staten Island. Soon after, sails appear on the horizon. 45 ships drop anchor inside Sandy Hook. By sunset, more than 100 enemy vessels fill the bay. Their masts rise like a forest of pine, endless and imposing. Henry Knox and his wife Lucy are at breakfast when the fleet appears. Lucy trembles with terror. By evening, the city is in uproar. Troops rush to posts. Riders gallop to New Jersey and Connecticut, spreading the alarm. By nightfall, it is undeniable. The largest armada ever to sail into American waters has arrived. Panic spreads. Families flee. Martha Washington departs with haste, as do Lucy Knox and Catherine Greene, taking their children to safety. The city prepares for war. But Washington knows the truth. Whoever controls the sea will control New York. And the British now control the sea absolutely. The triumph at Boston already feels distant. Ahead lies a struggle far greater against overwhelming force. Independence has been declared. The cause is righteous, but the enemy is mighty, and the cost will be terrible. For now, Washington steadies himself. The defense of New York will be his greatest trial. The fate of the revolution hangs in the balance. July 1776. New York is still, yet restless. Soldiers and townspeople alike sense that the winds of history are gathering. Across the Atlantic, the British are preparing their largest military expedition ever seen in American waters. Warships and soldiers are en route, and the fate of a fledgling nation hangs in the balance. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress is about to make a declaration that will change everything. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress votes to dissolve the connection with Great Britain. The air is thick with anticipation and fear. On July 6th, news reaches New York and spontaneous celebrations erupt. Officers toast in public houses, unable to contain their joy. By July 8th, a formal letter from John Hancock arrives, bringing the full Declaration of Independence. Patriots realize the war has entered a new stage. By renouncing allegiance, the delegates have committed treason, and yet they do so for liberty. On the evening of July 9th, General George Washington orders his brigades onto the commons and parade grounds to hear the Declaration read aloud. Spirits soar, a moment of triumph for the army and the people. For the first time since the outbreak of war in 1775, hope shines bright. Yet, shadows quickly fall as British naval power reminds them how vulnerable New York truly is. On July 12th, British ships, including Phoenix and Rose, sail up the Hudson, casting off moorings at Staten Island. Alarm guns sound, citizens panic, and American soldiers fire nearly 200 rounds to no effect. The city is reminded of its defenselessness. 6 American artillerymen perish when their cannon explodes, casualties caused not by enemy fire, but by inexperience. The British anchor above the city, cutting off supplies, rousing loyalists, and leaving Washington to wrestle with a sobering reality. His army is underprepared for what is coming. By mid-August, the British fleet grows colossal. Over 100 ships appear beyond the Narrows, carrying 3,000 additional troops, thousands of Hessian auxiliaries, and supplies after months at sea. In total, nearly 400 ships, 73 warships, and more than 32,000 troops gather on Staten Island. For Americans, it is an almost unimaginable sight, an expedition so massive it dwarfs any force previously witnessed in the colonies. Washington faces a difficult decision. The army is outnumbered, and he must divide his forces against the long-held rule of not splitting strength before battle. He places troops on Long Island, hoping mobility across the East River will allow flexibility. His officers stress caution, knowing the ground is unfamiliar, the men untrained, and the enemy formidable. The largest battle of the war is approaching. August 27, 1776. The British land on Long Island with 15,000 troops and 40 artillery pieces. By noon, they advance inland under the command of Cornwallis. Loyalists greet them warmly, while the Americans scramble to understand the scale of the invasion. Washington, misinformed about the enemy's true numbers, prepares a modest response, sending only 1,500 additional troops. The Americans are dangerously outmaneuvered. The Battle of Brooklyn, or Long Island, begins. American forces face overwhelming numbers. Inexperienced troops struggle to hold positions. Chaos reigns as cannon fire tears through the landscape, homes and farms burn, and civilians flee. Yet, some American officers fight valiantly, displaying courage and resilience even in the face of crushing defeat. Washington wrestles with despair and hope. He reshuffles command, placing Israel Putnam over Sullivan, a poor choice born of necessity and stress. The safety of the army and of the nation depends on their courage, skill, and unity. Every decision carries immense weight, for the lives of soldiers and the survival of the fledgling United States hang in the balance. Disease, fatigue, and fear weigh heavily. Thousands are sick, and the living struggle to care for one another. Families are torn apart. Yet, amidst suffering, a remarkable resilience emerges. Patriots cling to the hope that liberty is worth the cost, that their sacrifices will not be in vain. As night falls, both sides pause, contemplating the day's events. The Americans have faced one of the greatest military forces in history and survived. Washington's leadership, the courage of his officers, and the determination of ordinary soldiers have been tested. The path ahead remains perilous, but the ideals of freedom, courage, and resilience will guide the next chapter of the American struggle. The birth of a nation is rarely peaceful. It is forged in fire, blood, and determination. New York will witness further battles, and the struggle for independence will continue. But in these early days, the spirit of a people determined to be free shines brighter than any army, any fleet, or any fortification. And so, the story of a nation begins, not with triumph alone, but with courage in the face of overwhelming odds. August 21st, 1776. General Putnam and 6 battalions crossed to Brooklyn, stirring the city and the army alike. Washington watches with concern. Troops are disorderly, untrained, behaving more like a mob than a disciplined army. Lectures are given, warnings issued. Putnam reminds all, the distinction between a regulated army and a mob is discipline. Across the river, British troops land with precision, perfectly orchestrated, their presence a constant reminder of the challenge ahead. That night, a terrifying storm strikes New York like a hurricane. Lightning falls in massive sheets, igniting homes, claiming the lives of 10 soldiers with a single flash. 3 officers are killed by a thunderbolt. Swords and coins melt under the heat, and bodies are blackened. Major Benedict reflects that while bloodshed in battle is expected, there is a hidden power in such forces unleashed by an invisible hand. Before dawn on August 22nd, the sky clears and the invasion begins. British frigates and bomb ketches position themselves to cover the landing. At 5 o'clock, 4,000 elite troops, carefully packed aboard flatboats, begin their journey across 3 miles of water. By 8, all 4,000 are ashore on an empty beach, landing smoothly, without opposition. Pennsylvania riflemen withdraw, driving off cattle and burning wheat fields, smoke rising toward New York. Wave after wave of British troops cross the river. Over 90 vessels fill the Narrows, a breathtaking spectacle of naval power. By noon, a fully equipped army of 15,000 men and 40 artillery pieces has landed. Every maneuver is coordinated, precise, and unopposed. More troops are on the way, including support staff and even women, showing the scale and seriousness of the invasion. In the early hours of August 27th, General Putnam is awakened to reports of enemy attacks near the Narrows and Gowanus Road. British commander Grant engages with 300 troops. Muskets roar and American soldiers flee. Putnam rushes to Sterling's camp, ordering him to hold the line and repulse the enemy. Alarm guns and drums sound. Troops fall into position, and commanders like Samuel Parsons ride to reinforce critical points. Sterling's force, 1,600 men from Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Delaware battalions, including James Smallwood and John Haslett, take their positions. British troops advance in regular order, colors flying, artillery in front. Sterling allows them to approach within 200 yards before opening fire. The Americans hold, firing with discipline and courage. Muskets blaze, men tumble, and for the first hours, the Continental Army stands its ground, believing they can match the British regulars. Grant boasts that he can conquer America with just 5,000 men, but Sterling and his men refuse to yield. Hessian artillery at the center bombards Sullivan's lines, yet the troops remain unshaken. Sullivan rides to Flatbush Pass to take command, seeing that Hessians are initially stationary. Sterling sends reinforcements, but the situation begins to deteriorate as British forces maneuver from behind, threatening to surround the Americans on the ridge. By mid-morning, the British execute a flanking maneuver. The Americans find themselves surrounded on the plains beyond the ridge. Sullivan swings his main force to face the approaching enemy. Outnumbered, the Americans fight desperately, returning fire with deadly effect. Officers on both sides fear their men will be cut to pieces. Riflemen spring from the woods, striking at officers and light infantry, creating confusion and terror among the British lines. The Continental Army faces a desperate retreat. Sullivan struggles to maintain order, leading his men toward Brooklyn lines. Many are overrun by Hessians, bayonets flashing, musket clubs raised. Soldiers plead for mercy, some surrender. Others fight to the end. Remarkably, most manage to escape through the chaos, even as their comrades are captured or killed. Stories emerge of near-miraculous survival. Lewis Morris fights between enemy lines. Joseph Hodgkins flees through marshes, unsure who lives or dies. Sterling, surrounded, refuses to surrender his sword. He breaks through Hessian lines and offers himself to von Heister. The first major battle of the Revolution concludes with a crushing defeat for the Continental Army. Over 40,000 men were engaged in the field over 6 hours, the largest battle of the war to that point. The loss is sobering, yet the courage of those who fought leaves a mark on history. British officers reflect on their success with mixed feelings. Grant notes that if a good bleeding can bring the Americans to their senses, the fever of independence may soon abate. Yet, even amidst triumph, there is recognition of the tenacity and bravery of the American forces. The Continental Army may have been defeated, but it has not been broken. By noon, the battle is over. Thousands of American soldiers are scattered, hundreds captured. The retreat is complete, yet not all is lost. The courage, ingenuity, and resilience of the Continental Army have been tested under fire. Leaders like Sullivan and Sterling demonstrate extraordinary bravery. This day will be remembered as the first great test of the new nation's resolve, a painful lesson in the cost of freedom. The Battle of Brooklyn marks a turning point. The Continental Army has suffered its first crushing defeat, yet its spirit endures. In the chaos of battle, courage and leadership shine through. Liberty will not come easily, but each sacrifice strengthens the determination of those who fight for it. The story of a nation is written not in victories alone, but in resilience, bravery, and the unyielding desire to be free. The Battle of Brooklyn is over. Many American soldiers could not run as fast as their foes, some ready to stumble over one another in panic. Losses are grim. Reports vary, but roughly 59 Americans were killed, 267 wounded, and 31 missing. Hessians report 5 killed and 26 wounded. Rebel losses are much higher in reality, with over 3,000 casualties, though numbers are often exaggerated. Washington later estimates around 701 killed or captured. Among the American dead collected, General Parsons reports 60, while enemy losses are relatively inconsequential. Few Americans openly admit the severity of the defeat. 3 generals, Sullivan, Sterling, and Woodhull, are captured. Sullivan and Sterling are treated courteously, dining with Lord Howe, while Woodhull succumbs to his wounds weeks later. Among prisoners are Captain Samuel Atlee and Lieutenant J.Z. Fitch. Atlee endures verbal abuse, while Fitch is confined with other prisoners, having fought bravely until surrounded. Stories of Hessian brutality emerge, but many accounts are exaggerated propaganda. Some prisoners record acts of civility, like being offered food by their captors. British and Hessian officers are astonished by the condition of American soldiers. Torn clothing, wretched farm attire, and poorly equipped officers make them appear as ordinary laborers rather than trained soldiers. Lieutenant von Bartleben notes that some officers quickly abandon notions of heroism when confronted with reality. Prisoners who kneel and surrender are sometimes beaten, yet most survive to endure confinement, starvation, and harsh conditions aboard prison ships, in churches, and crypts. As night falls, the Americans in Brooklyn's defenses wait tensely for the next British attack. Wounded soldiers cry out from the battlefield, and stragglers limp back into the lines. Among those returning, only 9 Marylanders, led by Morai Gist, survived the retreat. Across the army, the good news is that about 9,000 men, along with equipment and horses, have escaped without loss of life. The bad news is that the army is battered, dispirited, and shrinking, while the enemy continues to advance. On the morning of August 28th, the situation is critical. The American army is outsmarted, hemmed in, with backs to the East River. A change in the wind could trap them completely. Yet Washington remains calm. He orders reinforcements from New York, including Pennsylvania regiments and Glover's Massachusetts troops. Officers note the contrast between soldiers' saddened faces and the gleam of hope as reinforcements arrive. Brigadier General Thomas Mifflin surveys defenses, determined to ensure the army is prepared for action despite the critical circumstances. The weather worsens. Temperatures drop sharply, and a northeastern storm drenches the troops. Soldiers without tents struggle to stay warm, fires are difficult to maintain, and muskets and cartridges become wet. Men fall asleep standing or sitting in the mud. Washington gets little rest, sending hurried reports to Congress. While the storm is dangerous, it provides a crucial advantage. British house ships cannot advance, and the East River becomes a temporary barrier against the enemy. Washington convenes a meeting at Livingston Mansion. He receives counsel from Mifflin, who advises either fighting in place or retreating. Understanding the stakes, Washington emphasizes secrecy and decisiveness. All flatboats and sloops must be rounded up immediately. The operation must leave no traces, no noise, and no opportunity for the British to detect the plan. The retreat will require extraordinary coordination and courage from both soldiers and sailors. The night operation is painstaking. Troops under arms carry packs in total silence. Talking, coughing, or signaling is strictly forbidden. Wagons are muffled, and every movement resembles a ghostly procession. Officers and soldiers alike are exhausted, many without sleep for days. Yet Washington rides among them, calm and resolute, inspiring confidence despite the extreme danger. The army, ragged and inexperienced, must execute one of the most difficult maneuvers of the war, the nighttime retreat across the East River. Around 11 o'clock, the first boats begin crossing. Glover's men, experienced sailors and fishermen, navigate the swift currents in near-total darkness. Loaded boats nearly scrape the water's edge, inches below the gunwales. No lights are shown, for fear of detection. The operation requires extraordinary skill, precision, and courage. Across the river, Mifflin and his rear guard hold the outermost defenses, ensuring the army's safe passage. The risk of annihilation is constant. The withdrawal continues silently through mud and rain. Regiments leave their positions, filling gaps left by others. Graydon notes the extreme difficulty of moving inexperienced, sick, and wounded men across a mile-wide river. Officers must maintain order without revealing the true intent. Many soldiers believe they are preparing for a night attack, while others begin to sense the retreat's purpose. Every decision is calculated to avoid alerting the British. The outer defenses remain under the watch of Mifflin's and other veteran troops. They hold the lines, aware that any mistake could allow the British to discover the retreat. Hours pass, tension mounting, as the sounds of distant cannon fire and lightning intermingle. Washington personally oversees the operation at the ferry landing, ensuring that every regiment crosses safely. The order, discipline, and courage of both soldiers and sailors make this night maneuver one of the most remarkable feats of the war. By morning, the army has crossed. The retreat, executed in silence, darkness, and under enemy observation, succeeds. Not a single life is lost during the operation. Though the Continental Army is battered, demoralized, and diminished in numbers, the evacuation preserves its core. Washington's leadership, combined with the skill of Glover's men, has saved the army from annihilation. This extraordinary retreat demonstrates strategy, courage, and discipline under unimaginable pressure. The night retreat from Brooklyn is complete. The Continental Army has endured a crushing defeat, yet the spirit of liberty remains unbroken. Soldiers and officers alike understand the peril they have faced and the extraordinary measures required to preserve their forces. From this night forward, they know that resilience, courage, and careful planning are as vital as courage on the battlefield. The fight for independence continues, but the Americans have proven their determination and ability to survive against overwhelming odds. It is still dark, around 4 in the morning. Young Major Alexander Scammell rides through the outer defenses, searching for General Mifflin. Scammell, 29, a Harvard graduate and attorney, serves as aide to Sullivan. He informs Mifflin that the boats are ready and Washington awaits the remaining troops. A miscommunication arises. Mifflin misinterprets Scammell's orders, thinking the troops should march immediately for the ferry. The consequences could be disastrous. Troops begin to leave their positions. They halt near the old Dutch church, tense and uncertain. Washington, astride his horse, demands answers. Faces are hard to read in the dim light. Washington exclaims, "Good God, General Mifflin, I am afraid you have ruined us." Mifflin responds, with some warmth, that he was only obeying orders conveyed by Scammell. The mistake is quickly corrected, and weary troops return to their lines. Hours are spent waiting, counting every minute until relief arrives. Graydon reflects on the bravery of these men. Those who returned to their positions did so under extreme difficulty, in darkness and under constant threat. They recover their stations without the enemy noticing. Meanwhile, at the ferry landing, troops, supplies, and artillery are loaded onto boats. Everyone works furiously, aware that the operation's success hinges on timing and secrecy. Connecticut soldiers recount making multiple crossings in a single night. Time is running out. Heavy artillery gets mired in mud and is left behind. Morning approaches, and a large part of the army is still waiting. Without the cover of night, escape would be impossible. Yet Providence intervenes. Just at daybreak, a dense fog settles over Brooklyn, concealing all movement. Even at sunup, visibility is limited to a few yards. On the New York side, the fog is absent, allowing for a precise landing once the army crosses. By 7 in the morning, the rear guard and remaining troops at Fort Sterling are summoned. They embark last, ensuring that no one lingers unnecessarily. Soldiers recall seeing Washington remaining on the ferry stairs until the final men departed. In less than an hour, the entire contingent reaches New York safely. Across the East River, 9,000 troops have escaped in a single night, without a life lost, only 3 men remaining behind due to plundering. The British are astonished. Overnight, the rebels have vanished from their fortifications without a single shot fired. Shipping cannot navigate the East River due to wind, and the American army has escaped entirely. Immediate reports describe surprise, relief, and disbelief. General Grant cannot comprehend why the Americans abandoned such massive works so readily. Lord Howe performs admirably, yet even he is puzzled by the ease of the enemy's retreat. Some British officers view the retreat as a daring and brilliantly executed maneuver. Percy, recalling the events of the 27th, believes the Americans may never stand in the field again. Clinton writes proudly of his role, but notes prudence in restraining pursuit. Cornwallis avoids overstating the capture of Brooklyn lines in Parliament, knowing that a full assault might have been costly. Many British commanders agree. The retreat, conducted under extreme danger, is a remarkable feat of strategy and courage. Washington's leadership is critical. Good fortune, careful planning, and extraordinary discipline allow the army to escape annihilation. While withdrawals rarely win wars, this operation preserves the core of the Continental Army. Though over 1,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured during the battle, the retreat itself demonstrates exceptional skill. Washington's decisiveness, despite prior errors, ensures that the army lives to fight another day. The costs of the battle are severe. Casualties exceed 1,000, including prisoners and wounded. Commanders like Sullivan, Sterling, and Putnam face criticism for errors, missed opportunities, and insufficient vigilance. Jamaica Pass remained unguarded, and Sterling's valor in open fields is both praised and faulted. Nathaniel Greene's absence, due to illness, is felt acutely. Yet, despite mistakes, the retreat highlights the courage, resilience, and adaptability of the American Army. Across the colonies, reaction is mixed. In London, news of the American retreat is met with jubilation. Parliament and the public celebrate a grand victory. Tory newspapers proclaim the rebels defeated, yet colonial papers emphasize the brilliance of the escape. Americans view the retreat as both a humbling defeat and a testament to Washington's leadership. Writers describe Providence favoring the rebels, acknowledging courage, skill, and a measure of luck that preserved the army. In New York, gloom pervades. The army is filthy, bedraggled, soaked, emaciated, and sick. High spirits expected after the battle are gone. For nearly 24 hours, soldiers and officers, including Washington, collapse in exhausted sleep. The city, quiet and tense, reflects the uncertainty of the war. Yet the escape ensures that the fight for independence continues. 9,000 men have survived to fight another day, preserving hope amid adversity. The Brooklyn evacuation is complete. The Continental Army has escaped a trap that might have ended the war. Washington, his officers, and the soldiers demonstrate that courage, ingenuity, and discipline can prevail even against overwhelming odds. While the battle is a fiasco in losses and strategic error, the retreat becomes a masterstroke of survival. The Americans may have lost Brooklyn, but their spirit endures. The war is far from over, yet their resolve is stronger than ever. September 16, 1776. The Continental Army struggles with discipline and desertion. Soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, steal supplies, refuse orders, or defect to the enemy. Epidemics of disease and insubordination sap the army's strength. Joseph Reed, overwhelmed and demoralized, contemplates abandoning the army. On this day, he witnesses a soldier fleeing from the enemy. Reed orders him back. The man raises his musket and pulls the trigger, but the lock fails. Reed grabs another gun, pulls the trigger, and it also snaps. Drawing his sword, he strikes twice, wounding Lieutenant Leingwell and severing his thumb, forcing a surrender. Leingwell, guilty of cowardice, is sentenced to execution. At Reed's urging, Washington grants a last-minute pardon after Leingwell kneels to be shot. The next offender, warned Washington, will face death without mercy. Introducing discipline in a fledgling army proves a formidable task. Reed reflects in letters to his wife that in a democracy where equality prevails, establishing strict discipline is odious but necessary. Washington, though calm outwardly, keeps a firm grip on command, knowing swift and effective measures are essential for survival. Reed writes to John Hancock, "Our cause cannot be won by isolated acts. It must be carried on systematically. Good officers are mandatory, and only permanent enlistments can produce them. Soldiers must receive proper pay, equipment, and bounties, including land grants. Reliance on militias alone is like leaning on a broken staff." He observes men dragged from their homes untrained, timid in the face of seasoned troops, craving plunder, and unwilling to endure harsh punishments. Congress responds, enacting stricter rules. Enlistments for the duration of the war are rewarded with 2,100 acres of land. New articles of war, modeled on British discipline, allow stiffer punishments, including up to 100 lashes and the death penalty for major offenses. Proposals for a military academy are discussed but never realized. Washington, in a letter dated September 30th, confides candidly about the Army's miseries. Regiments reduced to 50 men, another to 14 fit for duty. The Army is unhappy, divided, and beset on all sides by logistical and strategic challenges. By late September and early October, the air is crisp, the skies clear, and the river sparkles. Yet the beauty of the season belies the Army's struggles. British ships line the East River, the Hudson gleaming under the sunlight. Many hope the war will pause until spring, but by October 9th, those hopes are dashed. The Phoenix, Roebuck, and Tartar, with a brisk southwesterly wind, force passage beyond Forts Washington and Constitution. American attempts to block the river with sunken hulks and spiked logs fail. Fort guns open fire, yet the ships sail slowly through to safe anchorage upstream, with only minor casualties. The Hudson is now undeniably under British control. By October 12th, the British plan to outflank the rebels by water. In very thick fog, a massive armada sails up the East River. Advanced forces of 4,000 troops land at Throg's Neck, a marshy peninsula in Westchester County. American riflemen check the advance along a narrow causeway. Reinforcements arrive after additional British troops land. Howe, recognizing the precarious terrain, decides to re-embark. This maneuver consumes 4 days, showcasing the British skill and the difficulties of coastal operations. Washington understands the danger. The British seek to outflank his forces and strike inland toward Kingsbridge. The army must withdraw, concentrating at safer ground 18 miles north at White Plains. Sterling and Sullivan rejoin after prisoner exchanges, welcomed warmly by Washington. The army is retreating, but the enemy is right behind them. Fort Washington remains a critical point, with passage along the Hudson insufficiently blocked. At a council on October 16th, commanders decide to hold Fort Washington as long as possible, preserving communication across the river to New Jersey. On October 17th, the army prepares for the march. Tents are struck and poles, benches, and equipment are loaded onto wagons. Only the sick or infirm remain behind. Each regiment marches in strict order, ammunition and flints complete. Crossing the narrow bridge at Kingsbridge, the army heads north along the west bank of the Bronx River. The sick bear the heaviest burden. Soldiers struggle with wagons and heavy cannon, their iron burdens rolling down hills, yet the army advances steadily. October 18th, early morning. British Hessians land at Pell's Point unopposed and begin moving inland. Glover observes the activity from a hilltop, anxiety gripping him. Acting swiftly, he gathers 750 men to resist. They fight tenaciously behind stone walls, inflicting heavy casualties and stalling the enemy advance. Baldwin's regiment joins the fray, maintaining calm as the shooting continues. Reports suggest upwards of 200 enemy casualties, though some numbers are exaggerated. The British, impressed by the ferocity of resistance, advance slowly. Skirmishes inflict casualties, but rarely allow rapid movement. Howe hopes to draw Washington onto open ground for a decisive victory, but meets stiff resistance. For several days, American forces skillfully delay the British, forcing them to advance cautiously through difficult terrain. This delay provides the Continental Army precious time to regroup and fortify positions further north. By October 28th, 10 days after landing at Pell's Point, Howe advances with 13,000 redcoats and Hessians up the main road to White Plains. The Continental Army, though weary and battered, has regrouped on safer ground. The retreat from New York, despite its challenges, demonstrates the resilience, discipline, and strategic foresight of Washington and his commanders. The campaign from New York to White Plains highlights the precarious balance of luck, skill, and determination. Despite defeats, disease, and desertion, the Continental Army remains intact. Washington's leadership, coupled with the courage and endurance of his troops, allows the fight for independence to continue. Each step northward represents not just survival, but a promise. The war is far from over, and the cause of liberty endures. The sun shone bright over White Plains, illuminating the glinting arms of both armies. Columns of British troops wheeled left toward Higher Hill and Chatterton's Hill, dominating the American lines. The ground before them was key, and Washington understood the importance. Reports indicate Lee rushed the militia to defend the hills, but British artillery drew closer. Cannons roared, smoke curled across the fields, and fences and walls were destroyed under bombardment. Limbs, muskets, and bodies mingled in a chaotic tableau of battle. Washington ordered more troops to Chatterton's Hill. The British Hessians crossed the river as part of 7,000 reinforcements. Uphill charges broke the militia's lines. Reinforcements, Haslett's Delaware Battalion and Smallwood's Marylanders, fought bravely, yet were gradually forced back. The Battle of White Plains, particularly at Chatterton's Hill, inflicted over 250 Hessian casualties, while American losses were twice as severe. Though valiant, the Americans achieved no decisive victory. The day after, October 30th, rain fell heavily. By November 1st, Washington's army had pulled back half a mile to stronger positions across the Bronx River. Both armies watched, waited, and studied one another. Officers noted the enemy's determination, preparing for a general battle under the most advantageous terms. By November 3rd, sentinels reported the rumble of enemy carriages. The Americans anticipated another attack, yet by November 5th, the British were in motion, heading southwest toward the Hudson at Kings Bridge. Washington's army had narrowly avoided disaster. The good news: the army had escaped White Plains. The bad news: it had been divided, with storms and uncertainty ahead. Washington divided his forces strategically. 7,000 men remained east of the Hudson under General Lee to check the British advance toward New England. Heath and 3,000 men guarded the Hudson Highlands. 2,000 crossed to New Jersey, to be joined by reinforcements. Greene maintained positions on the Hudson, coordinating overall command at Fort Washington. By November 12th, Washington reached Fort Lee after a grueling 3-day, 65-mile march. The army regrouped for the next phase. Fort Washington, a critical outpost, was poorly supplied. The fort's walls of piled earth enclosed 4 acres, with no barracks and water hauled from below. Despite these disadvantages, Commander Magaw and General Greene believed it could be held until the end of December. Washington, cautious and exhausted, deferred final decisions to Greene, balancing the fort's strategic value against the risk to his demoralized army. The British gained valuable intelligence. William Deont, an American staff officer, defected from Fort Washington, delivering plans and positions. Letters left unguarded at Trenton fell into British hands. Reports of discontent among New Englanders and Southerners reached General Howe. Mackenzie's diary notes that Washington's decision to divide his forces indicated weakness, easily observed from afar. The British, confident in their knowledge, anticipated Fort Washington's fall. By mid-November, the British concentrated their forces. Howe planned a 4-part assault with a major role for Hessian troops. The aim: reduce Fort Washington swiftly, then move on to New Jersey. The Americans, divided, undersupplied, and demoralized, faced a critical juncture. Washington and his generals debated the fort's defense, unsure whether to hold or retreat, weighing the fort's strategic importance against the risk of annihilation. On November 15th, Colonel James Patterson approached Fort Washington under a white flag, delivering a stark ultimatum: surrender the fort or face annihilation. Patterson, who had carried peace letters earlier in July, now demanded immediate compliance. Magaw and his officers quickly responded, aware that their decision could determine the fate of over 2,000 men. Inside the fort, tension was palpable. Washington's divided command left local commanders with the burden of decision. Magaw, knowing the fort's precarious nature and the weight of British intelligence, weighed resistance against the potential loss of all hands. Outside, British troops massed, cannons ready, while the Hudson remained open to enemy vessels. Every moment of delay increased the fort's vulnerability. As night fell, Fort Washington's defenders braced for action. Men checked muskets, repositioned artillery, and steeled themselves for the inevitable assault. The air was tense with anticipation, the river reflecting a calm that belied the storm to come. Washington watched from afar, knowing the choices he had made, dividing forces, holding key positions, would soon be tested in battle. The campaign from White Plains to Fort Washington demonstrates the delicate balance of leadership, courage, and chance. Washington's decisions, though sometimes indecisive, preserved his army repeatedly from disaster. Intelligence, discipline, and the morale of his men remained fragile. As the British prepared for a decisive strike, the fate of the Hudson and the American Revolution hung in the balance. Word of the ultimatum had reached Fort Lee. Commander Magaw's reply confirmed the grim truth: Fort Washington was lost. The good news: our war was not yet over. The bad news: it was the most devastating blow of the campaign so far. Nathanael Greene dispatched Ryder to alert Washington. The general dashed back, arriving at Fort Lee under the cover of darkness. Nightfall cloaked the river in darkness. Greene and Putnam rowed across to meet Magaw, appraising the situation. Washington followed in a small boat, midway across meeting them returning with an encouraging report. Troops remained in high spirits and would offer a stout defense. That night, unobserved, the British brought 30 flatboats upriver, with muffled oars, past Fort Washington into Spintundile Creek and down Harlem, preparing for the assault at dawn. On the night of November 15th, Washington, Greene, Putnam, and Mercer crossed again to assess the best course of action. A heavy cannon shot carried over the water. The first sounds of the assault reached them, signaling that the British were ready. 4 generals scrambled up steep slopes near the Morris House, all in precarious positions. Greene recorded, "Disposition made. Enemy advancing. We dared not make a new disposition." Still, disaster could not yet be seen. By dawn, 4,000 Hessians, led by Kniphausen, advanced from the north, crossing at King's Bridge. The main attack, executed with meticulous precision, showcased Hessian professionalism. Grant, though skeptical of Hessians, recorded admiration for their ability to surmount obstacles and scale the heights. British forces under Cornwallis struck eastward, while a third contingent of 3,000 British and Hessian troops advanced from the south under Percy. By 10 o'clock, Howe had committed nearly 8,000 troops, 4 times the number defending Fort Washington. Kniphausen's Hessians faced the steepest terrain. Withering fire from riflemen among the rocks slowed their ascent, yet the Hessians pressed onward. Officer Riederhold described the almost inaccessible rocky slopes, noting how soldiers dragged themselves over bushes and beach sand, barely able to stand. Finally, the Hessians reached the hilltop, greeted by the drummers and shouts of their comrades. Americans and Hessians mingled, the battle devolving into chaotic close combat. On the southern front, 150 men under Graydon faced Percy's assault. A single 18-pound cannon delayed 800 attackers, providing a brief, heroic resistance. Percy's troops captured the Morris House just 15 minutes after Washington had left. Despite courage and determination, the Americans were too few and their lines too extended. Retreat to the fort became the only viable option. 17-year-old Private John Idlom described the desperate uphill run toward the fort, dodging round shot and musket fire, witnessing friends wounded along the way. By 1 p.m., the defending force was driven inside the fort, scarcely able to find room. An hour later, Hessian Commander Kufausen demanded surrender. Magaw requested 30 minutes to decide, but Howe arrived and ordered immediate capitulation. At 3 p.m., Magaw surrendered. The entire garrison, 2,837 Americans, marched out between Hessian lines and laid down their arms. It was a disastrous campaign for New York, a humiliating and costly reverse. The capture of Fort Washington was catastrophic. Nearly 4,000 Americans had been taken prisoner from Brooklyn and Fort Washington combined. The Army, already suffering from sickness and desertion, faced rapid disintegration. Mackenzie noted that most prisoners were poorly clothed, filthy, and barefoot, a shocking sight to the British. Fort Washington's capture yielded 146 brass and iron cannon, tents, arms, and supplies, achieved by the Hessians in a matter of hours. Casualties were significant, but limited considering the overwhelming force. 59 Americans were killed, over 100 wounded. British losses included 28 killed and more than 100 wounded, while Hessians suffered 58 killed and over 250 wounded. The slaughter was narrowly avoided, as the fort could not accommodate large numbers of troops in combat. Prisoners were crowded into barns, sheds, and prison ships, hundreds later succumbing to disease. Washington, though outwardly composed, reportedly wept within his soul at the tragedy unfolding across the river. The consequences were deeply felt by both Washington and Greene. The commander-in-chief and his generals feared the ramifications for the campaign and the morale of the army. Letters from Joseph Reed, and Charles Lee reveal fury and frustration over the loss. Lee had predicted disaster and admonished Washington to draw off the garrison. Responsibility rested with Washington as ultimate commander, though Greene's judgment had influenced earlier decisions. The fall of Fort Washington illustrated the precariousness of the American position in New York. Washington's leadership faced severe criticism, yet his decisions repeatedly preserved the core of the army. The campaign demonstrated the importance of intelligence, discipline, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Though a devastating blow, it was not the end. The American army would survive, regroup, and continue the fight for independence. The loss of Fort Washington left the American army reeling. Supply depots across New Jersey were now in jeopardy, and the retreat path of the army stretched before them, vulnerable and open to enemy pursuit. Yet even in this dark hour, a singular act of heroism shone through. Margaret Molly Corbin, the wife of a Pennsylvania soldier, fought at her husband's side. When he fell, she stepped into his place, loading the cannon under fire, nearly losing her arm in the process. After the fort surrender, she was allowed to return home, a rare symbol of courage in a campaign marked by devastation. William Howe, methodical as ever, wasted little time. 3 nights later, under darkness and drenching rain, he sent 4,000 troops, primarily Hessians, up the Hudson, landing upstream from Fort Lee at Gloucester. Cornwallis led the advance. The British scaled the steep palisades via narrow footpaths, advancing with a daring reminiscent of Quebec's assault. By the time warnings reached Washington, the Americans had little time to react. From Hackensack, Washington saw the approaching British and shouted immediate orders to abandon the fort. Guns, stores, tents, even breakfast preparations were left behind. Only a dozen men managed to grab a supply of rum, drinking in haste before retreating. The army fled southward into New Jersey, battered, dispirited, and shrinking rapidly. The good news, your army survived. The bad news, the retreat was fraught with exhaustion, exposure, and vulnerability. The retreat began on November 21st, crossing the Hackensack River and heading toward the Passaic River. The army moved slowly through dead flat country, struggling 20 miles to Newark. Heavy rains and narrow roads created slippery mud, slowing wagons, cannon, and men. Many soldiers walked barefoot, feet wrapped in rags. Witnessing this, James Monroe recalled Washington riding at the rear, guiding a small band near the enemy. Though the army was reduced to perhaps 3,000 men, Washington's countenance showed no worry. He maintained firmness, dignity, and modesty, a beacon for the broken soldiers. The army left Fort Lee without tents, baggage, or trenching tools. Washington dared not risk engagement, leaving a very fine country open to the enemy's ravages. He urged General Lee to cross the Hudson with brigades to consolidate forces before it was too late. The fall of New Jersey would have devastating effects on Pennsylvania if the enemy advanced unchecked. Enlistments were up to 2,000, but soldiers were free to go at any time, leaving Washington facing the same nightmare as Boston the previous year. Morale was low, the army's chances seemed to evaporate. Privately, Washington confided to Joseph Reed the possibility of retreating westward into Pennsylvania, perhaps even as far as Augusta County in Western Virginia, if the eastern colonies could not provide reinforcements. The vast size of the country offered some protection, but also complicated troop movements. Washington dispatched Reed and Mifflin, 2 of his most trusted officers, to rally reinforcements. Reed traveled upstream toward Philadelphia, appealing to the governor of New Jersey for urgent militia support. Mifflin undertook a similar mission. Despite their efforts, the local population remained lethargic and divided. Rain fell heavily, roads became quagmires, and the army trudged onward, reaching Newark by November 22nd. The hardships endured by the army were unimaginable. Soldiers marched through cold, exposure, and rain without tents or proper food. Samuel Webb, recovering from wounds, observed, "No lads ever showed greater activity retreating than we have." The army's perseverance, in the face of suffering, left an indelible impression on observers like Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense, who volunteered to aid General Greene's staff in whatever ways he could. Washington's leadership during this period was critical. Despite the Army's despair, his calm and firm presence prevented total collapse. Every decision, from directing the retreat to coordinating reinforcements, was made under extreme pressure. The Army, though battered, retained cohesion, moving steadily southward across New Jersey, avoiding encirclement and keeping hope alive. The retreat through New Jersey was a test of endurance, discipline, and resolve. Though the Army had abandoned forts, suffered losses, and faced harsh conditions, the core remained intact. Washington's careful, deliberate leadership ensured that the fight for independence continued. Each step southward was a step toward preserving the Army for the battles yet to come. By the end of November, the American Army had survived a series of defeats and near disasters. Fort Washington and Fort Lee were lost, yet the Army's spirit endured. Washington's steadfastness, combined with the courage of soldiers and extraordinary individuals like Molly Corbin, provided hope that even in the darkest hours, the struggle for liberty would continue.